Okay, good. All right, so I'll post that up here in a little while if you want to go back and look at some of this. Okay, so I think the questions that we got were good because they really did hit on areas that I could see as being problematic. In some cases, the concept is a little bit maybe harder to understand. In other cases, the issue is the timing of the presentation of the material from Becker. And so that's sort of what I'm going to deal with in this question that you see here, because the person that submitted this was like, well, am I supposed to know all this? I didn't see it anywhere. I think this was chapter one, maybe, where this particular question was hiding was posted by Becker, and it would have been hard to answer without knowing some things that are covered in later chapters. They shouldn't do that. They should not do that. I've told them over the years, guys, you're asking this question at the wrong time. This should be placed back in another chapter's information. But they don't listen to me a lot of times when it comes to stuff like that, and there's not much I can do more than telling them. And I've kind of gotten to the point now where I'm tired of telling them about these things. So that means that it's a good material that they have, but it does have some flaws in it. Trust me when I say that by the time we are getting to where you're going to be using this material to do your final prep for your exam, a question like this would be fairly easy because by then we would have covered everything. Okay. But when you take a look at this, and in chapter one, they don't say a lot about the balance sheet. And it's also, I think, chapter three, where they get into a little bit more discussion about liabilities. But they're asking us to decide which of these are current liabilities. Really? Are you really going to do this to me? One second, guys. Okay, I'm going to reboot the PDF annotator. I have to believe that there's some kind of virus on my machine that knows when I'm going to start my lecture, and that's when it will decide to not let me write, because it happens in various softwares. Every time I'm starting class, this seems to want to happen, but let me try it. And sometimes I have to reboot the entire machine, but let's see if it'll be somewhat kind to me and let me not have to do that. Okay. Okay, good. Now, when you look at this current liabilities, now, rule of thumb, that unless the exam states otherwise, other kind of criteria being used by the company in question on it, a asset that will be realized into cash in a year or less, or a liability that will be liquidated, will be paid in a year or less, are typically considered current. Okay. So if you use that criteria here and we're dealing with year one, okay, and you start taking a look at some of these, um, accounts payable is almost always considered a current asset. Companies aren't going to let you wait more than a year to pay a liability like an account payable. And so that one would be considered current. So I'm going to go ahead and put a little C next to that. We're going to include that in the answer. Bond payable due in year two. Now, bond payable are often long term, but if it's due in year two, and we're preparing the balance sheet of December 31st, year one, then that will meet the current liability criteria. Deferred income tax payable. Now, when you look at this, you're like, okay, are they going to tell me anything about this deferred income tax payable? And it says it will reverse in year 3 and 4. And frankly, even if it didn't say that, they tell us in chapter 5, and I'll give you the page here in a second. They tell us in chapter 5 that all deferred taxes are considered non-current. So you don't really even have to have that additional information down there. But since they did tell me that here, then I can use that information to say that it is non-current. Okay. Now the discount on bond payable, and again, we get into bond payable later, but discount, if you were to take this 34,000, the bond payable, okay, and that's considered at face, then you would have to know that you have to subtract the discount on that bond to get the note, the net note payable, which would come out to 32,000. So that 2,000, it is part of the current discussion, but it would be a subtract. Dividend payable, following our rule of thumb, it is current. The 9,000 income tax payable, 9,000 income tax payable is income tax payable is almost always considered a current. The IRS wants their money. They're not going to let you, wait around for a whole year to pay that. And then no payable, and they again tell us that's 119 year 3. Now that's getting what? Beyond the 1 year criteria, so that would be non-current. Okay, so if you go through then and you take a look at the calculation here, okay, yeah, the 19,000 account payable almost always is considered, unless there's something else in the problem telling you otherwise, you would say that that's current. The bond payable, because it's due in year 2, using the 1 year rule of thumb, is current. We subtract the discount, the dividend payable, and the income tax payable. And then they tell us the deferred income tax payable 4,000 is reported as non-current. And again, that problem gave additional information. Even if it didn't have that information, you would know once you got to F5, page 83 was the page I was trying to remember a minute ago, that would be considered non-current and therefore would not be part of the answer. Now, again, the question was articulated, well, how am I supposed to know all this? What am I missing? And the answer is, I don't think you're missing anything. I don't think that they covered that in sufficiently for you to be able to answer that. They don't even talk about deferred taxes in the chapter that this came from, I think chapter 1. They barely talk about the balance sheet. It really is income statement focused in that discussion. So we're dealing with a very good presentation of the material from Becker, not a perfect presentation. And so it does leave something to be desired. I have told them about this kind of issue of asking things in a question prior to the student having learned this, but unfortunately they don't listen to me about a lot of these things, and so this kind of stuff still happens. What I will tell you is, one, you will get there, you will cover all this material, and then you can see how once you kind of knew that one little fact, I think this question became a lot easier, maybe that a discount is subtracted from the bond payable, which is in another chapter. And then I'm always here to help you with this stuff as well. Question. Okay, good. So that was a good question, and I could understand why that might cause some concern. And just to prove that that was the right answer, I went ahead and put that green color in the software, as I'm sure you know by now, tells you that that was the correct answer. Okay, good. Now this stuff was from chapter 2. Okay. And this situation where they want you to go from cash basis to accrual basis is probably one of the harder parts on the exam. And so I got a couple questions around this, and that's perfectly understandable that you'd be like, how am I supposed to wrap my head around this? Okay. Now, this is one of those things that you kind of have to commit to memory a process for answering these. And then you practice that process. And as you practice that process, that sort of memorization starts to turn to muscle as you start that repetition. You're like, oh, I've got this. I understand what I'm doing here. I get this. I know what the approach is on these, and then you will be able to quickly move through questions and even maybe a task-based simulation. And I'm going to talk about timing on the exam here a little bit before we're done this evening, because you're going to see that you are under a pretty strict time constraint for the FAR exam. And so, time management on the exam is going to be important. Okay. Now, what they did was they showed us the change in certain accounts here, and they wanted us to use this information to change what is the cash basis income. Okay. One second, guys. I swear somebody's watching my computer because they know when I'm needing it, and that's when everything starts trying to update and play little games with me. But anyway, and so what happens? You take a look, and we're going to be going from cash basis net income to accrual basis net income. Now, as you may have seen when you go through some of these problems, okay, the problems are typically asking you to go from cash to accrual, and it could be revenue, could be net income, like the one we're looking at. Some questions will go the other way. They'll give you the accrual revenue or the accrual net income and ask you to convert to cash. And so they can go either way. So I've given you a flashcard, and this flashcard, okay, is on, and I opened it today because I realized it wasn't opened before. So I guess I need to get back to e-learning to show you where that is. Oops, I don't need to turn anything off, but let me switch my okay, that flashcard that I just had up. By the way, I'm going to go through CPA exam time management, and that's up there now too. I'll open this file here in a little while. And then that's that flashcard that I just had up on the screen here. Okay. And so when you look at this, what I'm telling you is if they are asking you to go from like this particular question is from cash net income, and the same rule would work if it was cash revenue, and they're asking you going to accrual net income, or if they were asking you to go to accrual revenue, this is what you do every single time for that. So you start with the cash net income, which they gave us in that problem. For current assets, do the same. In other words, if the current asset increases, add the increase to net income or revenue. If if the item decreases, then subtract it. Go in the same direction. Subtract it from net income, subtract it from revenue if they're giving you the revenue, asking you the revenue. For accrual to cash, start with the accrual net income, accrual revenue, whatever the question is giving you. For current assets, do the opposite. If they increase them. If they decrease, subtract them. add them. If they increase, subtract them if they decrease. For current liabilities, do the same. If the liability increases, add it. If it decreases, subtract it. Now, the other rules here, always subtract depreciation, add fixed asset purchases, subtract long-term borrowing, and notice we go the opposite direction for those items if they're asking you to go from accrual to cash. If the problem is just asking about revenue, okay, then you can follow the above rules, but you're really going to just need to analyze related accounts like accounts receivable and unearned revenue and cash. And so, you'd apply the same rules to the current assets, current liabilities, but you really would just limit your analysis to relevant accounts, unearned revenue, accounts receivable, and of course, you're going to be dealing with cash in that situation. If the problem is asking about expenses or cost of goods sold, because sometimes the problems will do that, then use those above rules and reverse them. And I've given you an example of how that would work for that particular multiple choice question. Okay. Now, what I suggest you do is print these flashcards out. And for the time being, when you come to a problem like this, go ahead and read through what the flashcard is telling you and do what the flashcard says. But at some point, you need to fairly quickly start to wean yourself off of that flashcard and start practicing that from memory. And you do that enough times, it's kind of like I use the weightlifting analogy. You keep doing that enough repetitions, then you're pretty good at it and you'll be fairly strong on the exam and you won't have problems with these type of questions. Okay, so let's just go ahead then and look at this same question again now. And remember, we said to go from cash income, which they gave us, to accrual basis net income. You need to start with the cash basis net income, which I did. And for current assets, I said do the same. And so I looked, and accounts receivable did what? Accounts receivable increased. It went from 15 to 20, right? From the beginning of the year to the end of the year. That's a 5,000 increase. So I wrote, hey, it increased. So I just said plus 5,000 because I know I have to do the same since it increased. Prepaid expenses is a current asset. It decreased 3,000. I do the same. I subtracted 3,000. Accrued liabilities, it went down 500 from 2,500 to 5. I do the opposite. I add it, and when I do, I get 77.5, and I, of course, get the correct answer by doing that. Now, just to make sure we're clear on, and I'm not going to go through every single account and every single impact of every single situation here, in this question and what could be in other questions. But if I'm using cash basis and they say the following information, the company's records tells me that accounts receivable went up from 15 to 20, that means that there's 5,000 of income that I didn't record under the cash basis because I hadn't received the money yet. It wouldn't be until next year that I would have debited cash and credited income because I'm not taking, or credited revenue, because I'm not taking revenue until I receive cash under the cash basis. What I should have done was done what? I should have, using accrual, debited accounts receivable, okay, and credited the revenue for 5, thus increasing, right, my revenue and therefore increasing my net income. Since I didn't do that under cash basis, that's the logic behind having to add accounts receivable. And trust me, guys, it works the same for every current asset. It works correctly for every current liability if you follow those rules. So just keep working with those rules, following those rules, and you're going to see that you're going to get very comfortable with that. And then it's kind of like learning to play an instrument or something, or learning to play a song on an instrument. You struggle and you struggle and you struggle with a song. Then maybe you don't look at it for a while, and then you come back, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I really got this, right? So you're going to have to trust that process here and go ahead and use that flashcard, but you are going to start to want to commit that to memory. Question.
I have a question, Professor.
Sure.
Are we free to go ahead and just kind of give these a try and get the answer wrong, take our notes from it, go back, kind of reshuffle the deck and come back and try these again without that affecting our grade? Because I
Yeah.
kind of
Oh,
watched
yeah,
those.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay,
No. There is no penalty for trying. Now, I don't see that it's terribly productive to bludgeon through the questions repeatedly and then, think that you have mastered the material when after a while it's like, oh, I remember this one. I have to add 5,000. Don't do it that way. So you really should be going through the how to study process. Okay, so where is that? It's on e-learning, but let's see if I can find it without having to. I have like the same files open over and over again on my computer. Where would it be? Maybe it's here. Mhm. Oh, stop this. Sorry, guys. I'm talking to my machine. Okay, I think I got it. Let me see. Where is it? Oh, well, I'll just get it from e-learning. So the answer to your question, doing what you just described will not affect your grade, but again, it won't affect your grade in the class. It could affect your grade on the exam because you wouldn't be preparing correctly, and that's what we're all about here is getting you through this exam. So, you know, come to class. This is when I used to lecture page by page, but I think I pointed out to you there are flashcards that come with the material. And I saw you showed you a couple last time how to get through those flashcards. So memorize the cards they give you. On occasion, like in this case, I will give you a flashcard, right? um, and you know, you can also make your own flashcards of things that you're like, I understand what to do now, but I'm gonna make sure that I memorize the process I've learned here as to how to do this and make your own flashcard out of that. So you should be supplementing the Becker made flashcards with on the occasion ones I give you specifically, or if you ask me and I say, well, yeah, that's a good question. This would be a good flashcard, whatever. Okay. So you can do that. And then you should memorize the cards before you go ahead and start to work the questions. Then you work the questions, and if you get 75% on that, leave those questions alone because I don't want you to keep repeating the questions over and over again because you lose that process that you're going to have on exam day, which is I know this material, I've memorized the card or whatever on this, and this is how I'm going to attack it. If you keep working the questions, your brain won't be in that, you know, a chemical reaction, whatever, however that works. You're going to be using a different muscle that you can't use on the day of the exam because it's not going to be the same questions. And so leave them alone. Okay. If you feel you missed a question because there's no flashcard, what is the reason? Then look to see what the text said about that point. Ask me whatever it is. If you need to add a flashcard, that's okay. And then when you come back to those questions, and if you were less than 75%, or you can even do this a couple times, even if you are at 75%, tell the software to only give you the missed questions. Then it'll come back and you'll be able to see if you have now mastered that thing that was giving you some trouble. And then your percentage will come up to 75%. And that's where I kind of want you to leave it for now. Okay. And then you're going to go through this final review process as we get closer to the exam. And I'll be talking more about that final review process where you'll turn that 75% into an 85, 90% accuracy on the questions. And I'm here to tell you that if you get 90% accuracy on the multiple choice questions, that's translating into what, 45 points. You only need 75 points to pass the exam. You get 50 points available from your task-based simulation. 30 out of 50 is what, 60%? 3 divided by 5. Am I doing my math right? 3 divided by 5 is what, 60%. That's like D level work that you could be doing on those task-based simulation and still pass the exam by focusing on getting the mastery of the multiple choice questions following this process that I'm talking about. Is that a long way to answer your question? The short
Right.
answer is it will not affect your grade in the class, but I think you should go through this process.
No, that's good information. Yeah, rather than just trying to memorize that one specific question, we need to learn the process and retain the process. So no, that does make sense. And
Right.
then this material, if we're not going to take it immediately after, I mean, myself, I'm looking at maybe like June, July, a little bit. I got to finish tax season and then, really tack this and study it some more. We have full access to this, all this material, right? It doesn't just go away once.
Yeah, full access to the Becker material for life.
Okay.
The material, for example, this recording, okay, and the material on e-learning, I asked them to keep that available to you until the class runs again because I have to use the same shell. And so that would mean that for this class, let's see, summer, it would be available for you until next fall in September.
Okay, perfect. That sounds great. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay, good. Anything else on that particular point? Okay, good. So let me find the next question. Sorry with the annoying, the grotesque looking of the finger, but I can't, I have neuropathy. I can't feel things. So I have to do that. But anyway, okay, so let's go ahead with the next question. So I need to come back to here. Okay. And oh, before I forget, because when you're going to rework all the questions again, right? What you're going to, that's when you do the final review. I have you rework all the questions again. And so what you'll want to do at that time is you'll see your initials up here and then see where it says reset progress. Click that reset progress button. Don't do it until after the class is over because I need to see the progress you've made in order to give you the grade. But after the class is over and you've seen the grade and all that, you can reset progress. And when you do reset the progress, then all your work will go away. And then you'll be able to work the questions without it showing you the answer. And then it's like you're working the questions like they're new. So, but don't do that until after you've gone through all the material. I posted the grade. Now you're in the final review process. The class is over with. You've got 2 weeks before you're going to take your exam, let's say. then reset that, and everything comes back fresh as though you haven't tried it before, so that it's like working them for the first time, of course, with a higher accuracy because you've been studying the material. Okay. This question. Now, this question is asking about the single step income statement. Now, we have two different versions of the income statement that we talk about. We have multiple step and single step. Multiple step basically works like this, and maybe I should have had the, yeah, I should have the textbook up for this, I think. I didn't think of that till just now. I don't understand why this has started doing this. I swear there's some sort of sabotage going on with my machine these days. I can close this now. Okay, but I didn't want to close that, but okay. All right. Let me look at, full screen. Okay, good. We used to have a better presentation. By the way, yeah, this isn't telling you current and non-current. But anyway, they put in the context of an exercise, which I don't like because they kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater here. But when you take a look at this, okay, notice in the multiple step income statement, we have sections, okay? So if you go from your net sales, okay, all the way down to income from operations, okay, these are considered non-operating. I mean, operating, excuse me. Okay. When you come down all the way to these items, okay, these are non-operating. Okay. And then you have tax. And then if you have discontinued operations, you don't have to, then you would have discontinued operations showing down here. It's a little annoying that they had to mix in the discontinued ops here because most companies don't have a discontinued operation. If they did, yeah, the results of the discontinued operations would show net of tax. But most companies, the multiple step income statement going to have big chunks like this, three big chunks. Operating, non-operating, and tax. Every company is going to have that in the calculation of net income. Okay. Now, if a company were using a multiple step, that was a multiple step. If they were using a single step, what they do is they take all the things that add to net income and put them in one big chunk. And then all the things that subtract from net income and they put them in one big chunk. They call that the single step. Now, FASB requires, that's why most companies you see the multiple step when you look at their income statement, but maybe in the MD&A, they want to put some what they call abbreviated information, okay, whatever, smaller, there's another word for it, not abbreviated, but aggregated information, whatever term they're using. I forget the term they're using, but in the MD&A, they might use this single step to just give you a quick snapshot of what's going on. And then when you get to the full income statement, then you would be using the multiple step. Okay. Now, with that is just a very quick, discussion. Let's go back to that question. Okay. And let's take a look. And yeah, they're asking me for the single step, which means all my pluses are going to be in one place, all my minuses are going to be in the other place. And they're asking what I should report as revenues. Well, on that multiple step, single step, revenues and other items, yeah, okay. So what are the things that are going to be included in that first chunk up there, the revenues? And so you come back, yeah, sales, 250,000. Purchase discounts would be what? Would be a subtract from sales if you have a purchase discount. So you'd have to put that in the amount for the subtract. Now, the recovery from an account receivable written off, let's talk about that. When I set up my allowance for bad debts, I debit bad debt expense using maybe an aging of the account receivable or something. Okay. And I credit the allowance for doubtful accounts. I'm just going to abbreviate it allowance for now for our purposes. Now, bad debt expense, yeah, that appears on the income statement. The allowance appears on the balance sheet. So when I prepare my balance sheet, I'll show accounts receivable, whatever that is, minus the allowance. I'm just going to abbreviate that allow. So that my accounts receivable, okay, let me make it only 2x's. So that my accounts receivable shows up on the balance sheet net of the allowance. Now, I do that in the period that the sale is made because FASB has looked and says, hey, inevitable. The experience of the company is that there will be some receivables that will not be collected. That's a cost of doing business. And to match the sale with the inevitable not being able to collect on account receivable, if you want to collect all of your money, don't offer credit. Make everybody pay you in cash. But we don't like to do that because people like to have credit. But what comes with that is some people end up not being able to pay. Well, that's an expense of doing business. So you take that expense in the period, let's say that was year one, that you make the sale, okay? You debited accounts receivable when you made the sale on credit, you credited sales. And to match that expense of people not being able to pay you with the fact that you offer them credit to match that with that sale, you have to take that experience in year one. Let's say all this happened in year one. Okay. Now let's say year two, whatever. Could be year one, but let's say year two, the person, yep, here it comes. We knew it was coming. Somebody can't pay me. Well, when that's the case, at that point, you debit the allowance because that's why you had that money in the allowance. You had it sitting there waiting for the day, inevitably, okay, that maybe somebody wouldn't be able to pay you. I'll just put 1x for that. And you credit the account receivable because, of course, you have to write off the receivable because now the person can't pay you. So the write-off doesn't affect the income statement. What affects the income statement is putting money into the allowance, putting it there, waiting for the day that somebody may come and tell you that they can't pay. And then later on, when that happens, could happen in the same year, could happen the year after, the year after that, whatever, that money was sitting there in the allowance so that when you write off the receivable and you debit the allowance, net on the balance sheet, there's no effect of that. It just flipped from what the allowance came down and the receivable came down by the same amount. Since they're netting against each other, that's a zero impact on the balance sheet. The income statement approach would have happened at the time that you set up the allowance, at the time that you made the sale. So the write-off, oh, and then, okay, that's the write-off. And then, I don't know, let's say you recover this in year three. If you recover this in year three, and it doesn't have to be in year three, then you would do what? Debit the account receivable, credit the allowance. Now, sometimes I'll get students say, well, now there's too much in the allowance. No, there's not. No, there isn't. No, there's not. No, there isn't. We put amounts in the allowance for people who really end up not paying, that our experience shows will not pay, not for people that have a couple rocky innings, tell us they can't pay, and then later figure it out and pay us. So we put that money back into the allowance, waiting for the person that our experience has shown us really ends up not being able to pay, not people that kind of maybe for a second couldn't pay and then do. Our estimation process, our percentage of uncollectible would only include those that really we do not collect on. So that person here in this little example wasn't that person. So we put that money back in the allowance waiting for them. And then, of course, since we are recovering that and they're paying us, we would debit cash and credit the allowance. I mean, credit the account receivable for that to now liquidate that receivable into cash. The overall impact on the balance sheet is nothing. All this did was move money out of the receivable into the allowance, back into the receivable, into the allowance, and then out of the receivable and into cash. But the net effect on the balance sheet was nothing. And clearly the income statement is a 3-year ago memory at this point, because the income statement impact was recognized back in the year of sale, which in this little example was year one. And so when you looked at this one, the only thing that belonged up in that revenue section of the single step income statement was the amount of sales, the 250,000. Now, when you look at this, you're saying, well, how the hell was I supposed to know all that from chapter 1? And the answer is you weren't. We don't get into the allowance until later chapters where they would have a full discussion of that. So I understand why this question maybe gave you some heartburn, because we didn't cover all this of what to do with the allowance in chapter 1. Question. No? Okay. Did I hear something? No, I heard a no, I guess.
I, I was just wondering, would it make more sense to answer the questions that we know have been discussed to kind of just, I don't know, I guess kind of work in order and then just skip those ones that are like, this just doesn't even look vaguely familiar, and hold on to those until we get to that chapter and come back? Or are you looking for us to complete these modules in order to keep that timing down?
I'm not, well, it's okay. So let me start with the short answer to your question, which is no, don't do that. Try to get them right. You know, if you're sitting there and you're like, okay, I don't know if we covered this, because that shouldn't happen a lot. Okay. And so I don't want you to get into where you're making a judgment, well, we didn't cover this, when in fact maybe they did. And you just aren't remembering it for whatever reason, right? Or maybe it's in the chapter and they didn't cover it, but it's still contemplated that you would have learned it in that chapter. So let me be more specific in what I want you to do by showing you the software. Um, in fact, let's do it for that question you just did that was asked. 6566, 6565. Okay. And you're looking at this, and we know now the answer is 250,000. Not that that's important. But let's say you want to see, did they cover this? Okay. And you come over and you click textbook. Okay. Okay. And they took you to the same place I was showing you, the single step income statement. And so you'd get some of that there, but then you might keep going and say, well, okay, thanks a lot, but I don't see what to do with the write-off. Then you would kind of know, well, that wasn't covered in the chapter. Therefore, that's one of those things that I'm going to ask John about, or look around in the book and see if I see it somewhere else, but don't do that. That's why we're doing this, so that you can ask me this and I can tell you, yeah, that wasn't there, or yeah, it was there and you needed to look. But if you don't go through this process, you know, you needed to understand this and, you know, X, Y, and Z, whatever. If we don't go through that process and you just decide, I don't know what's going on, so they must not covered it, that's a good opportunity to have a miss communication between what you're supposed to be learning and the question. I am not holding you accountable for going through this material in any particular order. We were on chapter 2 today. You know, theoretically, I guess we'd be on chapter 3 next time. You could ask me a question from chapter 5 if you want. You just need to give me the question ID. I don't need it to come in order. Question on that? Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Okay, good. Let's take a look at, and I think, guys, we're gonna get out a little bit early, so what I'm gonna do is just kind of roll through and skip breaks and okay. But there was one more thing I wanted to look at. Numbers written down. Okay, there they are. Okay, so as I had shown you earlier, there it goes. Okay. On e-learning, I have added a PowerPoint that talks about the exam structure, and this is the structure for both bar and FAR in terms of the 5 testlets that we have, the type of questions that appear in each testlet, And as you can see, testlet 1, the first testlet you work, and you have to work the testlets in order on the exam. You can't jump around. You don't get to go to testlet 1 until you go to testlet 2 and so forth. You don't get to go to testlet 2 until you finish testlet 1 and so forth. And as you can see, 25 multiple choice questions in the first 2 testlets, 2 task-based simulations in testlet 3 and 5, and then for testlet 4, you have 3 task-based simulation. Now, they're putting breaks down here in between testlets. That's telling you can only take a break between a testlet, but only between testlets 3 and 4 will the timer pause for you for 15 minutes. So I recommend that you not take a break until the timer pauses between testlet 2 and 3. You know, I don't want to be personal here, but don't drink a lot of water, just prior to the exam. Okay. Don't drink a gallon of water or a gallon of soda or something. Drink up a bunch of coffee because you want to, stay awake or something. You'll have plenty of adrenaline to keep you awake. Okay. And I think you know why I'm saying that, so that, you can take the necessary appropriate bio break and whatnot between testlets 2 and 3. Now, the total exam is 4 hours. Now, the AICPA has basically told us that the halfway mark of the exam is between testlets 2 and 3 and 4, between testlets 3 and 4. And so that's the AICPA's cryptic way of telling us, well, if that's the halfway mark, then you should spend 2 hours before the halfway mark and 2 hours after the halfway mark, since they're saying that's the halfway mark. Okay, so the AICPA isn't going to come in and say, spend 2 hours on testlets 1, 2, and 3, and 2 hours on testlets 4 and 5. They're not going to do that. They are implying that, though, by telling us the halfway mark is between testlets 2 and 3. Well, that means if I got a 4-hour exam, 2 and 2, as I've shown here, as I've drawn on this slide. Okay. Now, what do we do with that information? Well, if that's the case, then that means that we have to break our time up accordingly amongst these testlets. So if they're telling us what? They're telling us that we should spend 2 hours to work 5 task-based simulations, right? 4 hours to work 5 task-based simulations. That means when I do my math on that, I take 120 minutes, I divide it by what? I divide it by the 5 task-based simulations that come in testlets 4 and 5, and that gives me what? That gives me 24 minutes per testlet, per task-based simulation, right? Now, what happens? Then I say, well, okay, if that's the case, and if I have what? 2 times 24 is 48 minutes, so I'm going to spend 48 minutes on testlet 5. I'll spend 48 minutes on testlet 3, 2 times 24, and 72 minutes on testlet 48 minutes on testlet 3, 48 minutes on testlet 5, since they each have 2 testlets. And then testlet 4, 3 times 24 is 72, 72 minutes on testlet 4. So now I'm like, okay, well, how much time do I have left to work the multiple choice questions? Well, if you take 120 and you subtract what? You subtract the 48 minutes that I am to use on testlet 2, since I'm supposed to remember spending 2 hours on those first 3 testlets, then that means that I spend what? And now my, I spend what? I spend 72 minutes on testlets 1 and 2, or 36 minutes each. Now, 36 minutes each, and if I have 25 multiple choice questions, that comes out to about 86 seconds per question. Now, 86 seconds per question is not a lot of time. Well, it's almost close to a minute and a half, I guess. Um, but that's not really the way to time yourself, because some questions you might be able to work in a minute and a half. Other questions, maybe you work them in 30 seconds. Some questions might take you a little more than a minute and a half. Maybe, maybe, and no more, guys, than 3 minutes. If you start spending more than 3 minutes on any one multiple choice question, you've blown your time budget. Do not do that. Do not do that. If you're having trouble with the question, you've worked it, you've been spending about 3 minutes. By the way, this is not when you're doing your homework. This is on the exam, and during the final review, I'm going to start asking you to worry more about time. Right now, I want you to worry about accuracy, getting the right answer. So spend a little more time than 3 minutes, that's okay. But once we're ready into the exam, the maximum amount of time you should spend on any one multiple choice question is 3 minutes. Okay. If after 3 minutes you're not sure, choose your best choice, and you can mark that question. Now, it is my advice that you really don't mark any more than maybe 5 questions. Okay. Because if you have a bunch of questions marked, that's not going to be any good. Choose your best choice, mark that question. So if you were to have time left over, you could go ahead and then go back and look at that question before you submit that testlet. Okay. Again, mark the choice, because you have what? Maximum 36 minutes. So if you start and you write down the time, when you're in the exam, you write down the time that you started that testlet, write it down on your scratch board, scratch paper, whatever it is they give you, write it down that I started testlet 1 at 1 o'clock, let's say, and write 1:36. And if it's 1:36 and you're to the end of that testlet, do not go back and try to re-answer, a question that was maybe giving you some trouble. You've selected your best choice. I know you marked that question, but if you've already reached the 36-minute mark, move on. Of the 50 multiple choice questions, there's probably about 10, 5 to 10 questions that are not graded. They are pre-test questions. So if you're going back and blowing your time budget trying to answer a multiple choice question that's a pre-test question, meaning it's not going to be graded, you are wasting time. So take your best choice and move on. You get in, you submit that testlet 1. Now you can't go back to testlet 1. You go into testlet 2. Don't spend any more than 36 minutes. If you have little time left over, it's, you've only worked on it for 30 minutes. Hey, I got, 32 minutes. I got 4 minutes. Then maybe you can go back and look at some of the ones you marked, but not otherwise. Probably best to keep moving forward, okay, and use the time accordingly as you go through. Now, you work those first 2 testlets, then you have your first testlet with task-based simulation, okay? 24 minutes per task-based simulation. Now, within these task-based simulation, there may be more than one task that you do, okay? Do the easiest task-based simulation first, and do the easiest task first. Okay, whatever you find to be the easiest, that's the one you do first. You are going through, guys, and you are trying to gather as many points as possible that you can, okay, to sit here and rack up a 75 on the exam. So if there's something that you don't understand, okay, you know what? Take your best shot, put something down, because you get grades for what you put down correctly. So if you put nothing in there, you won't get any points. Put something down to fill that out if you don't know, and keep moving on, finishing up with the hardest things last. But again, watching your time. No more than what? 24 minutes per task-based simulation, no more than 48 minutes in that testlet. Then you take your break, say your prayers, wipe your brow, whatever it is, use the facilities, whatever. Then come back following the same rule for testlet 4 and testlet 5. Now, if you're sweating profusely in testlet 5 and you're like, man, this is really hard, that means you're doing well on the exam. The exam uses what they call What do they call that? I forget what they call that now. Okay. But what they do is, I don't know what they call it, multi-stage, is it multi-stage multi-stage testing format. What they do is when you submit testlet 1, the machine automatically grades that. It doesn't give you a grade. It automatically grades that, knows how well you did, and will give you a harder testlet for the second if you did well in the first one. You do well in the second, the third one gets harder. You do well in the third, the fourth one gets harder. You do well in the fourth, the fifth one gets harder. Now, I'll always have the inevitable question, well, then I should just, not show off and just kind of be mediocre throughout the exam and have a good time. No, you can't do that, okay? They do this because they're trying to decide if a student should win the, why am I having trouble with all these things that I've said a million times? The Watt-Sells Award, Elijah Watt-Sells Award. They give that award to students who have gotten 95% or better on all 4 parts of the exam within a calendar year. Okay. Most of those people are use Becker to prepare, by the way. But it's not something that everyone strives for. But you can't sit there and say, well, I don't care about the Watt-Sells Award, so I'm just going to go, screw this thing up some of the time so the exam is easy. You got to do your best throughout. Okay. Question on any of this? Oh, one more thing. Of the, what is it, 3 plus 4, 7 task-based simulation, 1 is not graded. Again, you don't know which one it is, though. And so you have to keep moving around through the easy points. If there's something you can't figure out, put something down and move on. Don't sit there and try to be, I know we're, gonna all be CPAs and we're sitting here and we're trying to be, attention to detail and all that good stuff. You can suspend some of that on exam day because it's really important that you spend the appropriate time with each one of these, because if you blow your time budget on a task-based simulation that's not graded, meanwhile you don't get to say the last one in testlet 5 and that one is graded, that's going to be a disaster for your score. Question. Okay, now having said that, and the reason I kind of timed that there is that we had a task-based simulation as a submitted question for today. And that one was 3, oops. That one was 3, 1, 0, 0, 1. Now, when I looked at this question, okay, and hopefully you can see it. I don't know if I can make it a little bigger. I saw the name of this company, Thayer International. And I'm looking and I'm like, Thayer was the name of a person that used to work for Becker, that doesn't work for Becker anymore, and was, submitting questions under extreme pressure and whatnot to come up with questions. And so when I saw that, I'm like, yeah, this is not a very good question. I don't know that the exam is going to question you in this manner. Then again, maybe they got some, reconnaissance from somebody that took the exam recently and said, they asked something like this and they resurrected this and decided to bring it back or something. I don't know. But I'm not in love with this question. I think this is something that's a little old. But let's go ahead and look at it anyway and see how we might have handled this. Okay. So what they do is they're showing us net income, okay, for 2 years. And then, let's see if I can move this over this way, for 3 years. And then they want to ask you, would there be a journal entry to correct the balance sheet for any one of these problems? Okay. Now, when you see and you look at this question, okay, you have to kind of read these directions, and maybe this is the reason they kept it, because my understanding is that the exam does have these weird kind of worded questions like this these days. But the following transaction recorded in the books and records of Thayer International, a highly diverse conglomerate. Enter the correcting debit or credit related to any error you identify based on the description of each transaction. Identify the correction net income in each of the years presented and to the balance sheet in the final year by entering the appropriate amounts in the associated cells. For income adjustment, enter debits as positive numbers and credits as negative numbers. For year 3 balance sheet adjustments, enter all amounts as positive, because they are debits and credits, right? And that, again, if you looked at that, they're literally asking me for debit and credit. And so you would just enter a debit or credit using positive numbers. There's no such thing as a negative debit and a negative credit, because then they become debits and credits, right? Okay, so just enter whatever the amount is. But for the income statement items, positive numbers are going to be, let me read that again. Enter the correcting debit or credit related to description of each transaction. Enter the correcting debit or credit related to any identify the correction in net income in each year presented in the balance sheet. Note for income statement, enter debits as positive numbers and credits as negatives. In other words, with parentheses around them. Okay. Now, when you look, a positive net income is a credit. Okay. When you have a positive net income, that's a credit that's going to ultimately go to retained earnings, right? So if I have a positive amount in my income summary, I would debit income summary, credit retained earnings. And so net income is seen as a credit, right? So if you have something that should increase your net income, then you should go ahead and enter that as a credit. If you see something that should lessen your net income, you'd enter that as a debit, okay, as a positive number, in other words, as opposed to a negative number with the parentheses around it. So when I look at this, a 2,000 account receivable for sales made in year 2 was not recorded in year 2, but was recorded as a sale only after the cash was received in year 3. Well, that means that I should have done what? I should have shown net income in year 2, not in year 3 when the cash was collected. And so when you're saying, well, what's the effect on net income here? Net income has to increase, right? And since income is a credit, I have to credit it. I have to enter that as a negative number. So I go ahead and there it is. The format is showing correctly. It's entered as a negative number, and by saying a negative number as a credit in the parentheses, okay, to get it to show parentheses. And then for year 3, because they took the income in year 3 when the cash was collected, but it should have been income in year 2 when they made the sale and recorded the receivable. They should have debit account receivable credit sales. They didn't do that. So I put that amount as a increase in the income for year 2. And then for my year 3, I need to take that out of year 3 income because it should have been year 2 income. And since I'm trying to enter a debit to income to reduce it, then I have to enter that as a positive number. Okay. And then there's no balance sheet effect here because what happens for year three? Because what happened? Well, I got the money, so there wouldn't be any receivable, and I took the income when I took the cash, when I got the income, when I credited revenue on the balance sheet, there's no more receivable because I've collected on that, so I don't have to do anything to the balance sheet for this transaction. Now, I think the question that was asked, and I'm not sure if that's what was meant, maybe I misunderstood. It was saying, well, I don't know how to get the income numbers correct here. Well, the income is now correct because we had what? We had a $6,000 loss before, and now we have 4,000, so it corrected itself. And then it was an $85,000 income, but because we took amount out of income, so this spreadsheet is self-correcting itself. You don't have to go down and calculate this part. If you made a mistake on any one of these, you would not be penalized and they would not subtract points. In fact, they would award points to you for things that you got correct up here, and there's no penalty that this bottom line would be incorrect because you made a mistake. And so up here, and so that's why even if you can't figure it out, you'd fill out something in all of these, because even if you got it wrong, let's say you entered this one as a negative also, you'd get credit for this one being positive. And the fact that you would have the wrong number down here would not penalize you on the exam. So fill in everything. Did that answer the question that was being asked on this question? One bit of advice that I can give you while you're sort of getting yourself comfortable with correcting journal entries, which is what this thing is essentially asking you. Ask yourself, well, what should have happened in year two? Let's just talk about year two. What should have happened in year two is I should have debited accounts receivable, 2,000, and credited revenue, 2,000. Now, if that was the only transaction that happened the entire year, revenue would have been what? Would have been 2,000. There wouldn't have been any expenses. So my net income would have been what? 2,000. That would have been my income statement. Then what would I have done? I would have gone ahead and made closing entries by debiting revenue, 2,000, crediting income summary. I'm going to abbreviate that IS, income summary, 2,000. Then I would have closed the income summary by debiting it for 2,000 and crediting retained earnings for 2,000. Okay. And so the way that problem was contemplating it, saying, well, you're not going to restate those other statements. All we want to know is what would have been the right amount of net income in year two, year three, whatever was presented there. And would you have to make an adjustment on the balance sheet for year three based on what they're telling you the mistake was? And there was no balance sheet adjustment because what happened? What the company did was they debited cash in 2,000 and credited revenue in 2,000. Well, the cash is correct. The cash is correct for the 2,000. And there's no account receivable, so there's no balance sheet effect. And if I'm only trying to correct my year three balance sheet for this, I would debit revenue for 2,000 and credit retained earnings for the 2,000 to get it appropriately now in retained earnings, which it would have been closed out to retain earnings when I did my closing entries for year 3 anyway. So it's already there. That's kind of an unrealistic look at things because most companies would restate the prior years where they made some mistakes. And so they'd go back and fix those prior years. And so, and fix the income statement for the current year by taking it out of revenue and then putting it into retained earnings like this. And so the retained earnings would then be correctly stated. But they would have probably restated those prior years and then just rolled the retained earnings correctly forward to get to what the current balance was supposed to be in retained earnings by the end of year 3, and the balance sheet would be what it's supposed to be by the end of year 3 anyway when they collected this money. So anyway, did that answer the question on this one? I'm not going to go through every single one of them unless there was something specific about one of them. Okay, so practice with that, and maybe for the time being, ask yourself, what would have been the correct entry? That will help you to figure out what the impact on income is, and then you can fix it accordingly. I think that's probably, in fact, even for the exam, I think that would be the way to attack something like this. What would have been the correct entry? How would it affect net income? Would it affect the year 3 balance? Is there something I have to fix for the year 3 balance sheet? That's probably the way to do this one. Question. Okay. And again, guys, if you ran into trouble on these, watch your time. 24 minutes. Watch your time. Move through these. If there's one you don't understand, skip it, go to the next one. If you don't understand, skip it, go to the next one. Leave the things that you don't know understood. If within your task-based simulation, there's another task-based simulation, there's another testlet you can go to. Within the testlet, there's another task-based simulation you can go to. Go to that one, leaving some of these things you don't understand alone, figuring out, hey, I still got a little time. I got maybe 5 minutes left that I can spend on that, but I'm going to save that 5 minutes and go over to the other task-based simulation with this Tesla and fill out as much of the easy stuff as I can over here. Okay, now I'm hitting some harder points. Let me go back over here and spend that last 5 minutes over here. Okay, I don't understand some of these things. Fill everything in that you're giving me, I'm in trouble with in that second task-based simulation within that Tesla, spending no more than what I had put on those slides, the 48 minutes, the 72 minutes, etc. So you bounce around. Okay. Now, before we adjourn, no class next week. Right? Next week is the 18th. You study. On the 25th, we review, which means if you have already submitted some questions to me, submit them again for next week so that I have them sitting there high up in my inbox. Not the questions that I covered. You guys know what questions I covered. You know if I covered your question. I'm trying to be respectful. Can I say the names of the people that submitted questions? You guys mind if I say who submitted?
I don't mind.
Okay, so Shanna and Rebecca submitted questions. Everybody else, you didn't? Okay, in time anyway. So resubmit that question. Okay, resubmit it following the guidelines. What is it? 12 a.m. Monday by 8 a.m. Tuesday, the 25th. Submit the questions by then. I will tailor a lecture around the submitted questions. Is there any question on that? Okay, guys, if that's all, then enjoy the rest of your evening. Study, keep studying, keep up the good work studying, and I will see you on the 25th, 5 o'clock. Okay,
Thank you.
Okay,
Have a good night.
Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
good night,
Thank you,
guys.
Professor.
Have a good night.